Thanks everyone for coming to this short talk on Virginia Woolf's Flush. I'd also like to acknowledge we're meeting on Gadigal land and that the abiding and enduring stories and knowledge of this place is of the Gadigal. So this talk that I'm going to give today, unlike Flush, who was a purebred Cocker Spaniel, my talk is a bit of a mixed breed, so it's a bit of a mixture. So there'll be some biographical information about Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Flush, so telling you the story of their life together a little, talking about Virginia Woolf and the novel, of course, and also about this particular copy of the book, because it was from the Roycroft Library, which was a subscription library on Rose Street, at least in the 20th century, on Rose Street in the centre of Sydney. So I'll talk a little bit about that history too, and the book itself. So you can see on the cover there the Roycroft label. So I first became aware of this particular copy of Flush and that it was in the Rare Books collection through the exhibition Rare Breeds, the Dogs of Rare Books and Special Collections, which was curated by Fiona and up in 2018. So I loved how dogs appeared throughout the library's collection and how this reflects their role as a companion species. It made me think about how the stories of animals are woven into the stories of humans and vice versa, and how this is reflected in material culture, such as a library collection. So you can see, that's Flush on display in that exhibition, which was upstairs in the cabinets on level 3. So in 1931, that was when Virginia Woolf started what she termed a little escapade, which was the biography of Flush. She had just finished The Waves, so a very different kind of novel. But the Flush was a spaniel who belonged to the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Flush had come into Elizabeth Barrett's life in 1841. As a gift from her friend Mary Russell Mitford to console her after the tragic death of two of her brothers. So one had died of illness and another, which was her favourite brother, had died in a shipping accident. And after this she fell into a depression, and her friend decided the dog would be a helpful and kind of life-affirming gift. So Elizabeth Barrett had lived much of her life, at least her adult life, as an invalid. She suffered physical and mental illness, which confined her to long periods of time in bed or resting. So she was confined to her room a lot of the time. So Flush became her constant companion in this room. And so she wrote 2 poems in his honour. One's on display on the cushion over there, which is To Flush My Dog, and there's another one called Flush or Faunus, and they're poems that really glow with her love for this creature. So she describes, so that's the first 2 stanzas. It's much longer than that, but that's the first 2, describing him as a loving friend and a gentle fellow creature. And I'll read one of the stanzas which describes the atmosphere in her room as she described it. So this is from To Flush My Dog, a bit later in the poem. But of thee it shall be said, this dog watched beside a bed, day and night unweary, watched within a curtained room, where no sunbeam brake the gloom round the sick and dreary. So that sort of gives you a sense of the atmosphere in this kind of sick room, or the room that she spent Elizabeth Barrett spent most of her time in at the time. So in Woolf's Flush, she describes again the oppressive atmosphere of this invalid's room as perceived by Flush, with its lack of light and its overpowering smell of eau de cologne. Because of course, Flush, how does Flush engage with the world? Through smell a lot of the time. So that's one of when you read Flush, and I'll read a few excerpts from it as I speak today, the kind of richness of the smells that Flush experiences is a real kind of a pleasure of reading the novel. So the life story of Elizabeth Barrett Browning is in part the story of her escaping from this room and from the restrictions of her very strict father. He tightly controlled her activities as well as the rest of the family. So writing provided this escape for her poetry and her letters. She had a lot of correspondence, and this was a way of connecting her with others, connecting with the world, and in turn this led to her meeting Robert Browning and their secret courtship. So probably one of the most well-known literary elopements. They married in secret in 1846 in London, and then they eloped to Italy. Who went with them? Well, Elizabeth Barrett's lady's maid, Ms. Wilson, who also, she was the witness to their marriage, she also went, but Flush did too. So Flush followed them to Italy. And after this, Elizabeth Barrett Browning was disinherited by her father and never saw him again. And after his death, they found all the letters that she had written to him after her marriage unopened in his possession. So he really cut her off after she was married. But in Italy, Elizabeth Barrett Browning flourished, and she had a son. Her collection of love sonnets from the Portuguese, of which there's numerous copies over on the table there. It's her most well-known work. Was published when she was living in Italy. So a lot of what we know biographically about Elizabeth Barrett Browning comes from her correspondence, and this is indeed where Virginia Woolf got the idea to write about Flush. Again, Virginia Woolf is also known for her correspondence, and she wrote in a letter to Lady Ottoline Morell about how she was reading the love letters of Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning, and she wrote, I quote, "The figure of the dog made me laugh, so I couldn't resist making him a life." It's a life with a capital L, so I had to write a biography. So Flush frequently appears in the Brownings' love letters as Elizabeth Barrett describes her days, and she always writes of Flush with the greatest of affections. And on a side note, their love letters have been digitised, and so you can see the originals in digital form, digitised by the Baylor University, so you can see the envelopes and the letters themselves, and try and decode the handwriting. So this project, Flush, for Virginia Woolf, might have seemed then, and perhaps now if it's a work you're not familiar with, a somewhat unusual project for Woolf to turn to, but it's actually quite congruent with her other works and also with her character. Woolf had a strong sense of connection with animals throughout her life, and this is described really well through her nicknames that she had for herself and for others. In the introduction to the non-rare books version of Flush from this library, the introduction is by Kate Flint, and she describes the nicknames that Virginia Woolf had for herself and others, and I'll just read from it because I think she says it probably best. So the Stephen siblings, so that's Virginia Woolf's family name, called each other by animal nicknames, a habit which Virginia extended to her friends and which continued throughout adult life, producing an entire personal bestiary. Virginia was always Billy or Goat or Ape to her sister Vanessa, Goat to her brother Toby. To Leonard, she was Mandrill to his Mongoose. So there's Virginia and Leonard there. So we've got Mongoose and Mandrill there, and also Pinker the Cocker Spaniel, who I'll come back to. Vanessa, who's Virginia Woolf's sister, was sometimes Sheepdog or Marmot, more often Dolphin. Writing to her lifelong friend Violet Dickinson, Woolf was Sparrowy, Emma Vaughan was Dearest Toad, and again Woolf was Goat to her. She addressed her friend and lover Vita Sackville-West as Dearest Creature and as Towser, the sheepdog. So as you can see, quite a list of animal-based nicknames there. Quentin Bell wrote in the biography of his aunt, Flush is not so much a book by a dog lover as a book by someone who would love to be a dog. Well, which I think is great, a lovely quote. And there is a real relish in her writing of Flush as a character and writing from Flush's perspective. So it does indeed provide you with this canine perspective on the world, with an altered sensorium attuned particularly to smell and to movement. And it evokes also the bemusement that dogs often seem to show towards human actions and activities. And if you live with a dog, you observe, like they observe you, and you observe them, and you imagine their way of sensing the world and how it may be different or similar to your own. And it's clear that Woolf was a close observer of her own human-canine relationship with her dog Pinker, who acted as the model for Flush. So Pinker's there, but also this is Pinker, who is in the edition of Flush is pictured as being Flush. So yeah, it's in the books, on the book's frontispiece, and in other editions that photo was on the cover. So Pinker was also a Cocker Spaniel, and Woolf had been given her by her friend and lover Vita Sackville-West. So like Flush was for Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Pinker was a close companion for Virginia Woolf. And while Flush is the story of Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Flush, it's also the story of Virginia Woolf and Pinker, I think we can say. And to some extent, it is the story of anyone who's had a close relationship with a devoted dog. So the genre of canine memoir and canine biography has developed to reflect the close and evolving relationship between humans and dogs. For example, the rise of the lapdog in 18th century Britain inspired literature such as the canine narrative Pompey the Little, which is here and over on the cushion, Pompey the Little or the Adventures of a Lapdog. And so this was also in the Rare Breeds exhibition back last year. It follows the life of a dog, using the lapdog Pompey as a way to satirise social and class divisions in 18th century England. So Flush too can be interpreted this way as a critique of class and gender, but this is one of many intentions of the novel. It also seeks to represent a canine consciousness, and this is what current criticism, literary criticism of Flush focuses more on, how the representation of non-human subjectivity rather than using animals as figures or metaphors that primarily reflect human society and behaviour. So canine memoir is a genre that continues to be popular, maybe more than ever. Sometimes it's written from a human perspective, other times from the dog's perspective. So contemporary works include Eileen Miles's Afterglow, so she writes about her pit bull Rosie, and reviews of Afterglow have often mentioned Flush as a precedent for that work. Others include Mark Doty's Dog Years or Alexander Horowitz's Inside of a Dog. Another one going back in time to the 1950s was My Dog Tulip by J.R. Ackley, and there's more, that's just a few. But it's certainly a genre, of canine memoir. So Flush gives the reader a sense of what it is to be a dog experiencing life alongside humans, and I'll read a little bit so you can get a sense of what I mean when I say this. So I'm going to read from the section where I'm not only read for a minute or so, from when they go to Florence. So they're in Florence now, and so rather than the close confined eau de cologne scented surrounds of the sick room, Flush is out in the streets in Florence. He nosed his way from smell to smell. The rough, the smooth, the dark, the golden. He went in and out, up and down, where they beat brass, where they bake bread, where the women sit combing their hair, where the bird cages are piled high on the causeway, where the wine spills itself in dark red stains on the pavement, where leather smells and harness and garlic, where cloth is beaten, where vine leaves tremble, where men sit and drink and spit and dice. He ran in and out, always with his nose to the ground, drinking in the essence, or with his nose in the air, vibrating with the aroma. He slept in this hot patch of sun. How sun made the stone reek. He sought that tunnel of shade. How acid shade made the stones smell. He devoured whole bunches of ripe grapes, largely because of their purple smell. He chewed and spat out whatever tough relic of goat or macaroni the Italian housewife had thrown from the balcony. Goat and macaroni were raucous smells, crimson smells. So that's just a section from the Florence section of Flush. This sense of defamiliarisation. So it's sort of there's that sense of the familiar place, but also like where it's saying it's a raucous smell or a crimson smell. It can defamiliarise our usual sense perception, and this persists throughout the novel. It moves between the biographer's voice to the perception of Flush, and we can see, smell and perceive through Flush's point of view. And this allows us to visit places such as Florence or 19th century London as experienced by a pedigreed pet dog, including the slums of East London. So one of the events of Flush is that Flush is dog-napped and held for a ransom, which was a common crime or common practice at that time. And this actually happened 3 times to Flush. But Virginia Woolf compresses it into one dog napping episode in the novel. And it was these descriptions of place that drew me to Flush and still does draw me to Flush. So in my own writing and research, I examine the connections between place, environment and memory, and how life stories can also tell the stories of places and share ways of knowing places. Virginia Woolf is a key figure in representing these connections through the framework of life writing. And although in Flush the subject of the narrative is a dog, Woolf uses similar techniques as in her other fictions in order to show the relationship between these internal, external worlds. Virginia Woolf, however, was critical of Flush. Although the book was a commercial success, it was one of her best-selling novels at the time. Maybe that's why she was critical of it a bit. She described it at the same time being, quote, too slight and too serious. But I'd argue that this is one of the novel's strengths. It has a lightness and a playfulness to it. However, it also gives the reader much to think about in terms of human-animal relationships and also gender. Elizabeth Barrett Browning herself compared the restriction she felt as a woman to the position of a lapdog, and in Woolf's novel, this tension between Flush's sense of order and familiarity, and also his playful and inquisitive nature echoes that of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. As I've already mentioned, there's been a lot of scholarly interest in more recent times of considering non-human or other than human perspectives in literature, and this has resulted in a surge of critical work concerning Flush, which up until recently had little critical attention paid to it. Some critics, following ideas from Donna Haraway, who's written influentially about companion species, see Flush as a literary representation of interspecies entanglement, and certainly the experience of reading Flush is to be constantly shifted in perspective between Flush, between Elizabeth Barrett Browning, between Woolf, between dog and human. I'll talk a little bit about Virginia Woolf and publishing, because she was also a publisher. As many of you will know, the Hogarth Press was run by her and Leonard Woolf. It was founded in 1917. This gave her greater control over the look and the presentation of her books than she would have had otherwise. And she well knew this. In 1925, in her diary, she wrote, "I'm the only woman in England who can write what I like." So she was well aware of her privileged position in this regard. Flush was initially published in an edition called the Large Paper Edition, which had a cream dust jacket with the photograph of Pinker that I showed earlier, printed in brown on it. The next edition was the Uniform Edition, and that's the one that we have here. As the name suggests, it had the same format as other books by Woolf. It was a cheaper edition, and it encouraged, through its uniform appearance, the collection of the set of all of her books. The book's end papers featured illustrations by Virginia's sister, Vanessa Bell. Here they are, somewhat obscured by the library labels there, but you can see the one of Elizabeth Barrett Browning sitting in bed there. So yeah, there's this illustration, so that's her walking with Flush under the Roycroft label there, and in the back there's illustrations of them in Italy. Vanessa Bell designed many of Virginia Woolf's book covers, so the sisters worked in tandem, and we've actually echoed this today, so for those who don't know, Fiona and I are sisters. The berry might have been a clue. So yeah, the library copy has affixed to the front the Roycroft label, which you can see here. So this Roycroft stamp here, the trade label, that's not from Flush, but it's another version of that logo. Yeah, so it was a bookstore, and it was also a subscription library, a lending library on Sydney's Rowe Street. It opened there in the 1920s. It was a business that already existed, but it opened on Rowe Street in the 1920s, operated till the early 1970s, which was when Rowe Street was demolished to build the MLC Centre. So there is still a Rowe Street, but it's a very short, kind of grey service alley stub of a thing, particularly compared to what it used to be, and I'll show a photo in a moment. So yeah, when I look at the copy of this book kind of forensically, you can see that little blue square there. That's from their dust jacket from the uniform edition. They were all blue. They were all this light blue. So it's still lurking underneath the black covering, which the Roycroft must have put on, because they also put their sticker on there over the top. Yes, so the dust jacket lurks underneath. Roycroft Library, I'll talk about that a little bit perhaps, because that's an interesting part of Sydney's history. So yeah, as I mentioned, it was on Rose Street, this street that was demolished in the 1970s, which was, before that time, a centre for Sydney's creative culture, a meeting place for local and visiting artists, musicians, writers and designers, had cafes and boutiques, artist studios and bookstores. So it's reasonably well known in Sydney's history as a sort of a centre of bohemian Sydney, particularly in the 1920s, but it continued on to be a centre for artists and a place that was very important in Sydney's creative culture. As you can see here, if you have a look at the text on the sticker, it promises the all latest and best publications, and that the library is well stocked and progressive. And although it doesn't quite state it here, though maybe progressive is a bit of a clue, the Roycroft was also known for selling banned books. And I'm not talking hardcore pornography here. It didn't take much to get a book banned. So, for example, in the 1930s, banned books were things like Brave New World or Down and Out in Paris and London. And the Roycroft was a library that specialised in literary work, in literature. There's a book that is a children's book from 1947 called Tales of Rose Street. So it's this book here, that collects stories from Rose Street, and the Roycroft section tells a few stories. So it's quite a charming book. It goes through the signs, like the hanging signs that were in the street, in Rose Street. And it has a couple of stories about the Roycroft, and one of them is about book banning, which is at the time when Norman Lindsay's Red Heap was banned. So that was the first Australian novel to be banned in Australia. Frances Zabel, and she was the owner of the Roycroft at the time, had a number of copies in the Roycroft. She didn't want them to be found by any raiding party, so her assistants, who all wore smocks, smuggled the copies out one by one and dropped them unceremoniously in various city garbage tins. So we can imagine that, these besmocked workers dumping Norman Lindsay's book in the garbage there. And the other story that's in this little book is about the logo. So the fish logo, and all it really says is, fish always attracted Frances Zabel. It was only natural that Adrian Faint should incorporate fish in his street sign for her shop, the Roycroft Book and Art Shop. So Adrian Faint was an artist who was particularly known for his illustration and book plates, and actually Rare Books here has a large collection of book plates. It was a way that artists could make money too, like somebody would commission them to design a personalised book plate for them. Faint also designed the sign, so you can see the sign here. So this is a photo from 1950. And you can see that doorway there is leading to the Roycroft. I found in newspaper records that the sign was stolen in 1954, so that little hanging sign there. So who knows where it might be today, I wonder. The book preserves something of the history of Sydney as well. So it adds this layer of place and time to a novel that, despite its brevity, gives the reader much to consider about a companion species, about literary biography, about place and gender, and about writing from a non-human perspective, and also about life writing. So ultimately, this sense of life, human and canine entangled together, is what persists from a reading of Flush. Donna Haraway writes of companion species that dogs are, and I quote, not surrogates for theory. They are not here just to think with, they are here to live with. And so with this in mind, I'll read one more section of Flush before I finish today. And this is from the moment where he is brought in to Elizabeth Barrett's room for the first time. So this is when they meet. Flush darted to the sofa. "Oh, Flush," said Miss Barrett. For the first time, she looked him in the face. For the first time, Flush looked at the lady lying on the sofa. Each was surprised. Heavy curls hung down on either side of Miss Barrett's face. Large bright eyes shone out. A large mouth smiled. Heavy ears hung down on either side of Flush's face. His eyes, too, were large and bright. His mouth was wide. There was a likeness between them. As they gazed at each other, each felt, "Here I am," and then each felt, "But how different." Hers was the pale, worn face of an invalid, cut off from air, light and freedom. His was the warm, ruddy face of a young animal, instinct with health and energy. Broken asunder, yet made in the same mould, could it be that each completed what was dormant in the other? She might have been all that, and he, but no. Between them lay the widest gulf that can separate one being from another. She spoke. He was dumb. She was woman. He was dog. Thus closely united, thus immensely divided, they gazed at each other. Then with one bound, Flush sprung onto the sofa and laid himself where he was to lie for ever after, on the rug at Miss Barrett's feet. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much for that. I was just sort of wondering, in describing the book Flush, is it in any way like a thriller, an adventure, or is it more just sort of a lightly amusing exploration of a relationship?
It's a biography, like because it conforms to the life story of Flush. It sort of begins with his ancestry. The Flush is born, and then at the end, Flush dies. So it's primarily a biography. I wouldn't call it a thriller, but there is dramatic tension in it, which comes from the dog napping story, for example, but also from Elizabeth Barrett's story too. She's confined in this sick room, and there is that sense of her. Also, probably a lot of people reading it would know her story as well. So you want to keep that in mind too, I think, when you think about reading the reading of it. A lot of people, perhaps they're not experts in Elizabeth Barrett Browning, but they possibly know a little bit about her. So I guess that's another connection in terms of for readers. So yeah, I wouldn't say it's high in drama, but within it, like I guess it does get you to think and kind of feel like a dog, and within a dog's world, drama and thrill is quite different, and it tries to approximate that, I think.
Good, thanks. That was really interesting and great. And I'm that person who's maybe going to make a comment as much as a question, but I just noticed with the Roycroft thing, and yeah, the fish that kind of has this, Worm-Ouroboros look, but it also reminds me that Gotham Book Mart in New York, which opened in the 20s, Francis Deloff's bookshop, had its motto was "Wise Men Fish Here," and I just wonder if there was. I mean, it feels unlikely that it would be coincidental that there might be a kind of fishing trope.
Yeah, I think that's possibly an influence.
And they had the sign
sure,
on the street
yeah.
was a picture of people fishing, and it said "Wise Men Fish Here."
I mean, the only things documented about why the fish design was used was pretty much what I read there, that she liked fish, and I found that quite unsatisfying as a reason. I mean, if you're going to have your book plate designed, it's as good a reason as any other. But yeah, for your business, yeah.
So shop the Roycroft. So this idea of kind of commercial or trade, Georgic kind of plundering. You can see a whole kind of way in which you could either put that in the inappropriately metaphorical traffic through animals, or in a more companionate, in this kind of the animal, the turn sense that you're talking about as a kind of ecological metaphor about the idea of resources and so on. And I have to say that my grandfather drove the lift at the Australia Hotel until it was demolished, so I know it was a very little thing. I will have been in the old Rose Street, much fabled by my parents, but yes, and it was next door to the Australia Hotel, so just a little bye.
It is a much fabled place, and I mean, it was before my time,
yes.
But it's sort of one of those places where, even, and perhaps especially if it's before your time, you hear about this place that you could never, can never go to, except by looking at the photograph.
It's like the primal scene, so a scene from which you are formally excluded.
Yes.
Anyway.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thanks.
Julie, yes. Thanks. Just a quick question. You've mentioned briefly that Virginia wasn't as happy with this work as with others, or she didn't think it as important. And you've also said that publicly it was received very well. But were there reviews? How was it received academically, or in terms of the
So yeah,
literature?
It was in general, and I'm speaking in general here, it was a popular success, but it was seen as a kind of a slight or a minor work at the time. I'd have to sort of look specifically at reviews, but it wasn't treated as a serious project. It was seen as more, I guess, of a side project, which maybe for Virginia Woolf it was too. Like The Waves is her most experimental novel, and it was a huge amount of work and effort, physically and mentally, for her to write it. And then I guess she was doing the Flush project to be a lighter project. But then when you read her diary, she does seem to struggle with Flush too. Nothing is easy in the world of writing. Thanks everyone.